In this lesson, we're going to go over some of the many major issues with macroevolutionary vestigiality. So more specifically, what we'll be looking at are what's macroevolutionary vestigiality, so-called functionless vestiges that actually have a function, the self-defeat of the concept of altered function vestiges, and then finally, why it biblically matters. So first of all, what in the heck is macroevolutionary vestigiality, especially for those unfamiliar with the term? Well, first of all, a vestige, which is where vestigiality comes from, a vestige is an organism's body part or organ that's claimed to be reduced and or altered or non-functional remnant version of another very similar body part or organ that exists in ancestral species. Probably understand more when we get into some examples. In other words, it's something that is said to have a function in one kind, but is then reduced and or has an altered or no function at all in the descendant kind. And this idea of vestiges is often used to try to prove phylogenetic macroevolutionary relationship between certain kinds. So this is where we get into macroevolutionary vestigiality. So in macroevolutionary lineage, it said that one body part in one kind becomes reduced and or becomes functionless or takes a new function in the descendant kind. Next, we'll look at some of these vestiges that are claimed to be functionless, but actually have a function. And the ones we'll specifically be looking at are goosebumps, wisdom teeth, blind eyes, and pseudogene. So first of all, goosebumps, they have the function of serving as fairly mild short-term cold resistance that is useful for humans. And some macroevolutionists will agree. They'll say, yeah, it's not totally functionless, but it's a very reduced form of a function, of this function serving in apes. Because to them, it seems fairly useless for humans. Well, I mean, if you got Robin Williams' level of body hair, it's probably not that useless. It's probably not that vestigial as it's claimed. And some say that it's actually just altered, that in apes, it's more making your hair stand on end for warding off prey, not for mild cold resistance like in humans. But the use of goosebumps to ward off predators isn't really even observed in gibbons, which are lesser apes, supposedly less related to us than greater apes like chimps and gorillas and orangutans. And bottom line is function. It doesn't have to be some grand function. Goosebumps have a function. It is useful. That use varies from human to human. Again, it's more useful if you have Robin Williams' level of body hair, but still a function. Now, when it comes to wisdom tooth problems were extremely rare before the Industrial Revolution in about the 1700s. And there are people today with a large enough jaw and a hard enough diet that don't need them removed so that they function like any other molars. You see, heavy tooth wear and jaw muscle use, like using your jaw as a vise or by chewing very tough material like grains and greens, roughages, and doing so often, diminishes wisdom tooth impact. So, wisdom teeth are not a vestige, something inherited from an ancestor kind that does not function well in this descendant kind. Wisdom teeth are something that millennia later has become less useful to more people solely based on human lifestyle progression. When it comes to blind eyes, meaning eyes in an organism that don't function properly, that are blind, these eyes can still perceive how much light there is, the amount of light, and the changes to that amount of light. And they still have most of their biological responses and can vaguely perceive movement. And when it comes to eyes in an organism, that for the organism collectively, its eyes do not function like, for example, ours do. Why do they have to be vestiges? I mean, eyes of an individual organism that are blind, they're not considered vestigial. So if the entire kind or species, if their eyes are blind, then they have to be vestiges of a whole nother kind? I don't think so. It's either when it comes to pseudogenes, which are more genetic vestigiality, less the usual anatomic. These are genes that are often considered functionless because they don't encode for proteins, which is a part of the definition of what a functioning gene is. The current scientific definition of a gene is a gene that encodes for a protein. So if it doesn't do that, then it's labeled functionless. And this definition has been considered by some, actually many, to be a very poor definition and in need of change. Because, yeah, just because a gene doesn't encode for a protein, which most genes don't, doesn't mean they're functionless. See, these pseudogenes, specifically, they do serve many different functions, most having to do with cell and DNA regulation. For example, according to INH, some pseudogenes, that is, exhibit antisense RNA properties, siRNA properties, and even an ability to affect mRNA stability. All these things having to do with RNA functioning, which is very important to the cells. If you've taken more advanced college biology courses, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, and don't believe me, then go take those courses. And also, certain pseudogenes, if removed, can actually cause essentially immediate, nearly immediate, death in certain organisms. So some of these are absolutely vital. Now we'll move to looking at concept of vestiges that, instead of having no function, have an altered function, and how it is self-defeating. You see, saying there are vestiges that have been altered and now serve a different function in a new kind is self-defeating, because if the body part has a different structure and therefore different corresponding function, because structure and function go hand to hand, how do you truly know then if something is a vestige of a body part in another kind when it has an entirely new, entirely different, that is, structure and function? For example, the human coccyx, misleadingly referred to as the tailbone, is a set of fused vertebrae that anchor multiple muscles to make many pelvic movements, like those required for reproduction and, I'll say, bio-waste removal, makes these such movements and more possible. You see, the only similarity between the coccyx and actual tailbones is that they're vertebrae that are past the pelvis. That's it. There's no other similarity. One is an unfused set, the other is a fused set. One serves all the functions of a tail, one serves absolutely none of those functions, and is all about pelvic movement. So why does the coccyx have to be a vestige then? It doesn't. There's no reason it has to be. It's assumed to be. A little more about that later. Another example, the human appendix, which for decades was toted around as an undeniably functionless vestige, does serve a digestive system function. But unlike the function of cellulose digestion, which the rabbit appendix serves, human appendix, what most scientists believe, serves the function of housing symbiotic bacteria. Now, if its structure and function is greatly alike that of the rabbit appendix, then how's it a vestige? Hence why its vestige status is massively inconsistent. See, some people say, well, it's an appendix, like a rabbit. And, well, humans have an appendix, rabbits have an appendix. I mean, so the appendix must be a vestige. But it's got an altered function because it doesn't serve any of the same functions that it does, like in a rabbit. Then others say, or it's just a different appendix and not a vestige at all. So macroevolutionists do not consider the appendix vestige for good reason. And another example, when it comes to so-called reduced hind limbs, like the so-called whale leg bones, or the boa spurs, or the hind legs of, so-called hind legs of the extinct mammal called the Basilosaur, they are simply used in securing position for copulation. They're not at all like legs, really, when it comes to function and structure. See, the whale's so-called leg bones, pictured on the left, there aren't enough bones there to really even look like or come close to those of leg bones. So how would one know they're leg bones, really? When it comes to the boa spurs / python spurs, pictured in the two images in the middle, what they are two free-floating sets of 4 bones that are hardly close to any quadruped legs whatsoever. And then the Basilosaur hind limbs, they are more likely to work like pelvic fins and are still quite off from land legs. Just look at that picture. You see, when it comes to the concept of altered function vestiges, they've made the definition of vestige so broad and vague to try to make macroevolution seem true. Altered function vestiges are just a broadening of the term vestige and a just general broadening of anatomic terminology in order to make it look like vestiges are real. Now, all in all, macroevolutionary vestigiality suffers the same problem as all the rest of the concept of homology. And that is that it's assumed to be true. A structure is assumed to be a vestige, and it's assumed to be from a common lineage, because it's assumed that similar structures verify or are evidence for genetic relation. Say, well, it's biologically similar, so there must be biological genealogical connection. But that does not have to be. You see, the origin of biological similarity is in the mind of the creator. It's not in the gene pool of an ancestor. So why does it biblically matter that macroevolutionary vestigiality is false? Well, if functionless vestiges are real, then it can make God look like he's either too lazy to make macroevolution able to fully remove an organ or body part, or that he's just leaving it there for essentially no reason. Because why would God leave a functionless organ or create a natural process that would leave a functionless organ in a descendant kind? What's the point? Why would he do such a thing? Now, I know some theistic macroevolutionists may have some objections to what I just said, so I'll end this lesson addressing those potential rebuttals. As I know some may say, well, maybe God made macroevolution to leave functionless vestiges as a way to help us be able to discover, prove, and learn more about macroevolution. Well, but all the things that were just gone through earlier show that vestiges would be a pretty lousy thing to use to do that with because of how much assumption must be involved, how much uncertainty there can be. And if you want to respond to that by saying, well, the reason vestiges would be a pretty hard way, would be a pretty lousy thing to use to do that with, is because of man's limited mind to see how it could be used for that. Well, if that's the case, then it just proved my point. Because if God knows that man's limited mind will prevent us from seeing how vestiges can be used to discover, prove, and learn more about macroevolution, then why would he do it? Since he's omniscient and omnipotent, if he wants us to learn about something, he's going to make us able to learn about it not too difficultly. Wouldn't require as much assumption and leaps as macroevolutionary vestigiality would require.